Good afternoon. I'm Bob Shrum, the director of the Center for the Political Future at USC Dornsife. We're delighted today to welcome the Honorable Pete Buttigieg for what should be a lively and interesting conversation. He is a remarkable leader who literally soared into the firmament of American politics in 2020. He's also a return guest at the center. During his presidential campaign, he spoke to a packed house in Bovard Auditorium, an event that was broadcast on TV channels across California. He and I will talk with each other for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will open this up to questions, a number of which have already been submitted by students. Anyone watching on Zoom is free to submit their questions in the Q&A feature, and if I have time, we'll get to them. So let's begin. Let's go right into this. Can you describe what it was like to move from being mayor of South Bend, Indiana, to becoming a major presidential candidate?
First of all, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be with you. I always really look forward to spending time with students because you tend to ask the best questions. I really enjoyed my last time at USC, and I'm sure this will be no different. So as you can imagine, it's kind of like being shot out of a cannon. I did not run for re-election as mayor of South Bend in 2015, expecting that I would turn around and seek the presidency. That's not in the playbook for a mayor of a small to mid-sized city. And we really didn't. There was a whole set of reasons why I felt like I could and should run for president when I did, but there's no way to know how that's going to go until you actually launch it. What happened was faster and more amazing than our wildest dreams. And so a lot of it was racing to keep up with ourselves and going from what had been hoping to get noticed in what turned out to be a field of about 20 people to finding ourselves flirting with the magic and dangerous word front runner by the end of 2019. And then ultimately winning the Iowa caucuses, although we didn't find that out until about 3 weeks after it happened, which is one of the reasons why we didn't win anything else after that. And we can get into that history if you want to. On the other hand, part of what I found was that the practice of local politics and government served me very well trying to get onto a national stage. And just to give you one example, the one thing I would do every few days as mayor is go to a local TV station, sit down with the anchor, and just subject myself to whatever questions they wanted to ask. It was a chance for me to get my message out, and it was something that forced me to contend with whatever was most important. And it turns out that the physical experience of sitting for an interview at, let's say, Meet the Press, isn't that different from the physical experience of going to WNDU in South Bend, Indiana, and sitting with the morning anchor there. I mean, there's an anchor, there's a studio, there's a couple cameras. You got a message, you got a few minutes, you get some questions, you know, some of them are coming, one of them's a surprise, some of them are tough, some of them are predictable. The scale is different in terms of how many people are watching, you know, probably 1,000 times more people watching the national broadcast than the local one, but the physical experience of doing it isn't that different. And so having done that almost literally every week for the better part of 8 years set me up very well for doing that kind of media work as a candidate. And I think it's one of the reasons why I was maybe a little bit less allergic to doing lots of wide-ranging interviews than a lot of candidates prove to be when they're running for president. And that in turn served me really well. Obviously the scope of the issues that we were called to talk about was dizzyingly vast compared to the things you work on as mayor, and yet every one of them related back to something that I worked on as mayor of my hometown. There was something in every story that I encountered that had something to do with the story that I encountered back home at work. So even though there's obviously any number of radical differences between a campaign that takes you from coast to coast and the kind of things you do in a city of 100,000 people, I actually would argue that there are few better preparations for running for office, any office, and also few better preparations for holding any office than that of local government, and especially executive leadership in local government, like being a mayor.
How'd you get into politics? What brought you to it?
Well, I knew by the time I was an undergraduate, I knew that I cared about politics and wanted to be involved in public service. But I thought and assumed that would probably mean either going to Washington and being involved on a staff of the kinds of people I saw on TV working on national issues, or what I really cared about most, which was international issues, which is part of why I studied Arabic when I was in college. But over time, especially after I finished college, I began to feel more and more connected to a hometown that I'd felt somewhat at odds with growing up in. When I was growing up, I was like a lot of people in a place like South Bend, Indiana, an industrial or formerly industrial city, getting the message that success had to do with getting out. And that's what I did. And as soon as I did, I began to realize that I was actually from somewhere. I began to feel an almost militant level of identifying with my hometown, especially when people would make certain kinds of comments about small cities or about the so-called Rust Belt. So I began to feel that tug home in a way that brought me closer and closer to it. Got a job in Chicago after I finished grad school at Oxford. That had me so close to South Bend that I was often going home and having a beer with an old friend from high school or checking in on my parents there, and found that the city was really looking for a different future. But the immediate cause of my running for office was when the economic crisis of 2008 and 9 happened, and our auto industry almost collapsed. To make a long story short, there was a big fight over whether to rescue Chrysler, which is a huge employer in Indiana. And our state treasurer tried to use his position to block the Obama administration from keeping Chrysler in business. I grew up in a city that was a company town for Studebaker. And even though that company had collapsed 20 years before I was born, all around me, including 50 years afterwards when I was mayor, you could see the incredibly destructive consequences of having the auto industry in a city be destroyed. I mean, so much so that I would argue that a city could more quickly recover from being hit by a Category 5 hurricane or a major earthquake, and cities have recovered more quickly from those things than our city did from losing a major auto company. And I didn't want to see that happen to anyone else, especially in my home state. So I ran for state treasurer at the age of 27. Nobody heard of me. Most people had never heard of the state treasurer either. And that's the kind of race that in a place like Indiana, in a perfect year, if everything went right and you had a lot of luck and you had a lot of money, and you had a major national wave behind your party, then as a Democrat, you could plausibly have a 40% chance of winning. None of those things were true in my case. And so we came nowhere close to winning. But that's how I learned how to run for office. There are 92 counties in Indiana, and I went to almost every single one of them, one chicken dinner at a time, going to union events, party events, parades, any place there were enough people that I could get in front of, learning how to be a candidate. And shortly after that race, while I was licking my wounds, deciding what to do next, the mayor's seat opened up in South Bend. Our longest serving mayor, 15 years, decided he wasn't going to run again. And that prompted a whole set of conversations about where our city was going. And for a city that was struggling to figure out its economic future and struggling to hold on to its youth, I began to realize that as a member of the young generation complaining about the trajectory of our city, it was a put up or shut up moment. And if I really cared about the city, then I needed to step up. And so I did. Again, to make a long story short, ran for mayor with the help of Mike Schmuel, who, by the way, is the main reason that I was able to participate in this event was his encouragement. And
he was a terrific fellow, by the way, terrific fellow.
I'm glad. You can learn a lot from him. I certainly did. And with his help, discovered that we weren't crazy, that other people, including people twice our age and then some, believed in what we were trying to do. And we wound up building a coalition that helped kind of outmaneuver an entrenched local party and become mayor of our hometown. And well, you know what happened next.
Yeah. Before you entered the political arena, You served in the US Navy. You were deployed to Afghanistan. Today, fewer and fewer people in national politics have served in the military. Can you discuss the value of that kind of military experience and how it's influenced, if it has, your public life?
Yeah, it's enormously influential in everything I think about, and I'm so glad that I got to serve. It is strange that we have gone from a time in which it was almost assumed that people who sought public office would have served. I mean, if you think about the generation of John F. Kennedy or George H.W. Bush, both of whom were in the South Pacific, in the Navy. Through to my generation, things took a dramatic turn. By the way, it was also expected that if you went to an elite university, you probably served. I think around the time of the end of World War II, fully half of the graduating class of Princeton went on to serve in the military. By the time I was in college, I think the number was in the single digits. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that happened. Part of what motivated me to serve was to realize that I could either be part of countering that or I could be part of the problem. I'm not saying you have to serve in the military in order to be a good public servant, but I think it helps. And I think it particularly helps because when you are in the military, you are compelled to spend time with people that you have nothing in common with. And not just spend time around them, but trust them, sometimes trust them with your lives. I was an intelligence officer, but a big part of my job wound up just driving. We called it military Uber. And it would fall to me to drive a vehicle outside the wire, either between Kabul and Bagram or around the city of Kabul off base, to get people and gear to where they needed to go. And the only way I could do my job, because of protocols around the amount of armed coverage you need, was to recruit volunteers to come with me, people I didn't command, but needed to persuade to be willing to get in a vehicle with me and go on, sometimes on a road that was known to have a lot of IEDs on it, improvised explosive devices on it. And the only way to do that was to work with people and trust them with your life. People who I had nothing in common with besides the flag on our shoulder. People with different racial and economic and regional backgrounds, people with radically different political ideas than mine. And we learn not just to live together, but to work together and to trust each other. And never has that been more needed than now. And it's my hope that through service, if not necessarily military service, then public service, volunteer service, community service, we can cultivate more of that, because we're going to need the forms of trust that are built in organizations or efforts that cut across typical boundaries rather than ones that work within typical boundaries, if we're going to get through what I think is a very tender and dangerous moment that our country's in right
now. Yeah. Let me follow that up. Do you think we should be creating more incentives and opportunities for young people to go into some form of national service, military or otherwise?
Totally, absolutely, and we are, by the way. One thing I'm really proud of that the administration is doing is the recently announced Climate Corps, which is a way to be part of service efforts connected to meeting the climate challenge. I just caught up with my old friend Josh Friday, who some of you may know is the Chief Service Officer for California and has structured a number of efforts specific to California that do just that. I campaigned on it as part of the plans that we put forward back when I was running for president. We need to create more opportunities to do that and back them up, not just with moral support, but I think we actually need to fund them and connect incentives and opportunities to it. And I think there needs to be more where that came from. We've got a great pattern to build off of with AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, the California service work that's being done, and now the Climate Corps that we're standing up, not to mention the military. And I think we need to create even more where that came from.
So you just talked about the Climate Corps, and it's just part of what an administration has done that can claim major achievements, not only in foreign policy, but legislative victories unmatched in the last 60 years. Yet somehow or other, the public polling doesn't seem to reflect that. What do you think is happening here?
Yeah, I remember being at the departure event for Ron Klain, our White House Chief of Staff, who left at the end of last calendar year. And with not even 2 years under our belt, I remember him reflecting that in those 2 years, the president had passed the most significant economic legislation since FDR, the most important infrastructure legislation since the Eisenhower presidency, arguably the second most important healthcare legislation since LBJ, and the most important industrial policy in more than half a century, while contending with the most serious public health crisis to hit the country in a century, the biggest land war in Europe since the Truman presidency, and all with the slimmest majority any Democratic president had had in, I think, also more than a century. It's such a dizzying array of accomplishments that it's hard to actually see it all and make sense of it. Which I actually think is part of the problem. It's like if you go nose to nose with the Sears Tower, and you just look up at it, you actually can't tell how tall it is. But also, let's face the fact that it's just been a rough few years as a country, before and during the Biden presidency. Our country's been through a lot, and it has been disorienting and bewildering and painful, even before we get to the things that have compounded that pain that have unfolded in the world and in our country in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And that's not going to lead to people feeling just great about how everything's going. Nor are we done when it comes to the economic work that needs to happen, including continuing to get a handle on the cost of living in this country and making sure Americans feel more secure about the trajectory of this country. To me, it says a lot that people are much more likely to report that their personal finances are going well than that they think the national economy is going well. And while it is possible, and I think to some extent accurate, to blame that partly on the noise machine and the amount of money and effort that is being spent talking down the condition of the country and the economy, it is also genuinely true that there are genuine reasons to be anxious and uneasy. And I think that finds its way into things like poll numbers. And we can't run away from that. We need to recognize the importance of contending with that and continuing to demonstrate the results that are going to come from these policies. I think about that in particular in the infrastructure realm, where passing the bill is just the beginning of the beginning. Even after you identify a project for funding, and we've got 31,000 transportation projects underway and counting, just among those that are funded by the Biden infrastructure law. Still a long way between picking out the project and getting to a groundbreaking, let alone completing the construction and having a ribbon cutting and people actually driving through the tunnel or flying out of the new airport terminal or doing whatever it is that piece of infrastructure is going to get you. It takes a while. And we're moving as fast as these things can move, and faster than used to be considered possible. But it's still not something where the credit is going to accrue automatically or quickly. And as not just an agency leader, but as a messenger, I'm very, very conscious of that.
Yeah, I want to skip to a question I was going to ask you later, but it comes right off of this. What do you see as the most effective Democratic message in 2024?
Well, first of all, it's the split screen that says you've got a fire hose of drama coming from over there, whether you're looking at the floor of the House of Representatives or the criminal trials of the former president or the chaos that you see in the social media realm or anything else. And we're getting the work done. We're building bridges and they're banning books. We're fixing tunnels and they're cutting each other down on the House floor. We are here to get stuff done, and we've gotten a lot of stuff done, and we're not done. And I think it can be a little unsexy, but really important for people to sense the commitment to just solving problems and working on things, even if some of those things need time to bear all of the fruit that they can. The other is that we're actually about making you better off. So the last folks really focused on two things when it came down to it. There were a lot of promises that were made, including, by the way, a promise of a big infrastructure bill, which is a promise the last president made, then broke. There were two promises they actually kept. One was that they promised to cut taxes for the wealthy and corporations, and they followed through on that. And the other is that they promised to eliminate a woman's right to choose, and they followed through on that. And I think looking at the promises they actually kept versus all the other ones they made, tells you an awful lot about what they're actually about. And the promises we made are about making everyday life easier and better, including making things more affordable, like insulin, which is now $35 a month instead of $400, something we were able to deliver for anybody on Medicare and would have been able to deliver for the entire country, except Republicans blocked us from that. We're still going to push until we get it done. That we were able to get the infrastructure bill done that a lot of others, including the last administration, promised but couldn't actually deliver, and did it on a bipartisan basis at a time when people say you can't do anything on a bipartisan basis. And on issue after issue after issue, our task is not to persuade most Americans to agree with us. Our task is to remind most Americans that they already agree with us, and then to continue to follow through on actually delivering.
Do you think we have to, or Democrats have to be somewhat modest and say something like, we've done a lot, but there's a lot more to do, and have a future offer out there for the country?
In one sense, yes. Look, we can't pretend everything's just going along fine. It's always bothered me, maybe because I come from the part of the country that I come from, and maybe because I'm part of the generation that I'm from, that we've ever tried to do that. Look, I would argue up until our administration got here, if you were my age or any younger, you had witnessed mostly, with the noticeable exception of the Affordable Care Act, most of what you witnessed in America was policy failure. So we can't just pretend that everything's fine. On the other hand, I think we also need to be immodest in a certain important way, which is that the subtlety that we have sometimes brought to our storytelling is too subtle. And it's one of the reasons I will literally bring big novelty checks to project sites where we are funding, where President Biden is funding, improvements that people, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or Independent, have wanted for a long time. Because otherwise it'd be very easy to confuse the story of how that actually happened and who ought to get credit for it. So yes, we need to be modest in a certain way about the scope of the challenges and the range of the work yet to be done. But I think we also need to be a little bit strategically shameless about how this stuff got done and who ought to get the credit.
You just mentioned President Biden again. You deal regularly with him. Can you give us a sense or glimpse of the kind of president he is behind the Oval Office doors?
Yeah, I wish every American could have the experience of being in the room with him, not just because he's a nice guy and the kind of guy you would proverbially want to have that beer with, although ironically he doesn't drink. But also because he has a level of focus. And look, I'm a guy who ran for president based on the idea you need you need more than anything something fresh and different, and that experience was less important than judgment. And I still think judgment is the most important thing. But I would say the judgment that the president has through his experience is something you feel when you're in a room with him and you watch how he drills down to the most important questions about how a given issue, sometimes a really convoluted policy issue, is actually going to affect people. There's a mixture of big vision, which every president needs to have, and detail orientation, which I think a good president should have. I'll give you just one example. As you might imagine, the president asks us a lot of questions about trains, because he's a passionate passenger rail user and advocate. We had one meeting where we came in and I knew there would have to be some experts at my side, depending on the questions he might ask. So we had not just me, but a deputy secretary, federal rail administrator, and the deputy federal rail administrator. So we had people who could get into the weeds on it. And as we were presenting something related to the acquisition of new train sets for Amtrak, he wound up asking so many questions about the rated capacity of the Amtrak train sets that we had to call in somebody who wasn't in from Amtrak to get us an answer to questions. But it turned out that detail was not just a curiosity, it was kind of material to where he was trying to take the policy course that he was directing us toward, which was how we were balancing the need for maintenance and reliability with the need to pay attention to the number of minutes that a trip takes, and how people's very conception of whether rail is a viable option is shaped by both of those things. He's also just a good boss, somebody who cares about the people who work with him as people. which sounds like a very kind of easy and simple thing to talk about, but is not something you can take for granted among leaders in this town. And in particular, I remember when we were going through a really dark period as a family a couple years ago when our son was hospitalized and we almost lost him. The way that the president pulled me aside and made sure I knew that he was supportive of me doing whatever I had to do for our family is something that I'll never forget.
Let me switch gears for a minute and ask you about something else that you alluded to earlier. There's a lot of concern about rising dangers to democracy in America. In your view, how divided is the country? And how can we reduce the polarization that now seems to plague our politics?
It's pretty rough, right? I mean, we all see what's going on, and the level of polarization, while not unprecedented in our history, I certainly consider to be unprecedented in my lifetime. The toxicity of it, the fact that not just opinions about what to do about a certain set of facts are polarized, that's just politics. But the idea that there can be polarization around what those facts even are, largely as a function of how our media environments have sorted themselves, that's terrifying. Because we have to at least start from the same conception of reality so that we can have a cogent argument about how to handle that reality based on differences in our values. We're supposed to take different values and use them to negotiate solutions to the same facts, not different facts that are convenient for our existing values. And if we can't shake out of that and construct a common operating picture of just what the world looks like or what our country looks like, we're really going to struggle to contend with the levels of challenge that we're about to face. I mean, the advent of AI and what that's really going to look like and mean soon, the challenges presented by China, and the challenges around our democracy itself require that we have some fundamental shared reality before we can even get into the other stuff. So I'm worried about it. In terms of what helps, like I said before, places where people can hear each other that are not defined by our politics or not even congruent with our politics. I'll put it another way. We all have these circles of belonging. And increasingly, it's become the case that those circles are concentric. In other words, my neighborhood, my faith community, my educational cohort, and my political identity all kind of fit within each other. What we need are circles that are not concentric but overlap, where I belong to a faith community that overlaps partly with the community of people who agree with me politically, which in turn overlaps partly with people who live in my neighborhood, which overlaps partly with people who I get to know because we drop our kids off at the same daycare, which overlaps partly with my fellow Notre Dame fans, and so on and so on. We need to really lean into those spaces that cut across the other spaces, because they challenge us to recognize what we have in common and what we have different with people. The military, by the way, is an example of that. Your unit, the boundaries of your unit have nothing to do with the boundaries of where you grew up or what political identity you belong to. So we need to fashion and support circles that do not just line up with other circles and be ready to belong to them fully. We need access to the truth and to good information, and we need credible arbiters of that information, which is, for example, what the editorial function of good journalism is supposed to do. And also in a different way is what the academy is supposed to do. It's what you all as students are doing, is trying to sift through interpretation and distinguish between interpretation and the underlying patterns or facts. And we need to actually get results. Trust is largely built on prior experiences of getting something done, which, by the way, is what I believe we're building as an administration. We are trying to get things done so that your only experience as a younger generation of policy is not policy failure, but things getting done well enough that it gives you a reason to expect more results if you commit more to shared things, shared projects, even as broad a shared projects as the American project, and want to be part of it. And be part of it through running for office or volunteering or even just as an engaged citizen or taxpayer, but there's some sense we're all part of the same thing. And I do think there are grounds for hope, not least of them. Obviously, I keep coming back to the stuff I get to work on because it's where my head is. But this infrastructure package, right? At a time when people contended that we were too polarized to be able to do anything in this country on a bipartisan basis. We got this infrastructure thing done on a bipartisan basis. I'm not saying we had most Republicans with us, but a lot of them crossed the aisle to work for us. How much of a better story is it that that we have a generational infrastructure package because Republicans were willing to cross the aisle and work with Democrats in Congress under the leadership of a Democratic president? Then what I'm seeing right now in the news that the latest likely candidate for Speaker of the House may be rejected for sins that include voting to keep the government open, certifying the election of 2020, and voting to embrace the legality of same-sex marriage and interracial marriage. All things that a vast majority of Americans are on board with, but for which he was punished or might be punished by losing a shot at the speakership, just like the guy who's actually in the speakership got punished for the sin of working with Democrats to keep the government up and running.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about this. I mean, I'm old enough that I can vaguely remember the 1960 presidential campaign.
Yeah.
And when Kennedy and Nixon were debating Medicare, Kennedy was for it, Nixon was against it. Nixon didn't say there are no elderly people in America who lack health care. He said, I have a different plan. I want to do this a different way. Today, you have people who defy Daniel Patrick Moynihan's old line, everybody's entitled to their own opinions, nobody's entitled to their own facts. Everybody can get their own facts, and social media is a big part of that.
Exactly.
So let me ask you, where do you see yourself? And then I want to get to student questions because you say they always ask the best questions. Where do you see yourself in the future? What do you envision yourself doing? And I could cheekily add, say in 2028.
So the politically smart answer is also the honest answer, which is I don't know. I know that every time I've had an opportunity, it largely had to do with keeping my head down and trying to do a great job in the opportunity that came before that. So I've got 110% of my attention wrapped up in trying to deliver for the president, for the country on this infrastructure work. I also know this isn't a job I can do forever. And as somebody who cares about this country and as a relatively new parent, I'm thinking about just how many ways there are to live a good life and make a good difference. I know that I'm relatively young as people in seats like mine go, and so I don't feel like I'm trying to tick things off a list of things I hope to have done in my life. I mean, I'm still pinching myself that I get to do the work I get to do every day because it's only 5 years ago that I got shot out of a cannon after being pretty much like any other mid-size or small city mayor in America. That's the best answer I can give. I know it sounds cagey, but it's true.
I didn't expect you to give any other answer. So we're going to turn to some questions from the USC students who have gathered for this event at the Center for the Political Future. First question is going to come from John Belton, who's a member of the USC Political Union. John?
Thank you for taking the time, Secretary. We've seen you on Fox News more than other Democratic politicians. Why do you appear so often on the show? And then what has the impact of those discussions been on you personally?
So the basic reason I do it is because I need to talk to people who don't already agree with me. And, you can reach folks on broadcast media, but the greatest concentration of people who don't already agree with us is going to be people who tune into conservative media. Now, I draw a pretty hard distinction between the what I would call the opinion side and the news side. Not that their news side isn't pretty opinionated, but there is a distinction that I think matters in terms of programs I'm willing to go on and programs I'm not. But the other reason I do it is because I expect and want to be challenged, whether I'm talking to a conservative media host or whether I'm talking to a conservative member of Congress when I'm testifying. And I know that I go in with the presumption that the question is coming in good faith. But if you think that's naive, it's also important to remember that regardless of whether the question is coming in good faith, a lot of people are watching the interview in good faith. And I owe it to them to make a good case for what I believe in. And I certainly can't blame somebody for not responding to our message if they've literally never heard it. And if you watch a media source that doesn't have a lot of Democrats on, you're not going to hear from a lot of Democrats unless we go there. In terms of what effect it has on me, honestly, it keeps me on my toes because it's less stimulating and honestly, less interesting if you know that an interviewer is never going to challenge you. Now, I have plenty of progressive interviewers who are challenging me too in a different way, and neutral, ideologically neutral interviewers who will challenge me in a different way. But I think there's a reason why sometimes even if I say the same thing in two back-to-back interviews on the same day, the one that will be more likely to go viral is when I said that same thing on Fox News than if I said the same thing on MSNBC, because there's just a little more tension on the string. And so it's interesting to do for the same reasons that it's interesting to watch.
Our next question comes from Patrick Stiles from the USC Political Union. Patrick?
Hi. Some people think that ranked choice voting can make elections less hyper-partisan. What is your opinion on ranked choice voting, and do you support it?
So I definitely think that it's one of the ways that we could achieve that. And I think it's been demonstrated to be successful in a number of places where it's been applied. And I would love to see more ranked choice voting used in more US elections. I don't think it's the only way to do it. I think there are other things that either in concert with ranked choice voting or kind of with or without it could make a difference. Obviously, fair districts is one of the biggest. Fewer than a tenth of our congressional districts are really considered to be competitive now. And that's part of the reasons why you find it, you see a speaker defenestrated for doing things that most Americans actually agree with. I think that reforms to Senate and House rules could make a big difference here. There's also the concept of a jungle primary, which at least that's one term for it, which is where you don't have two parallel partisan primaries generating the person most acceptable to each party base, and then they go at it, but rather you have a top two pass the post, and then they have a runoff. I think that can yield results, and I've seen examples out of California on how that can yield good results. So look, there's no one cure-all, but I think that's an example of a reform that is positive and makes sense and would make a difference. And I think
Nick, go ahead. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt you.
Paying attention to that, because obviously there's something about the way we just do things that doesn't work. And we can point to a lot of different pieces of it, from campaign finance to this district. But I think the point is, we can't just go on like this and expect the results to improve. There are structural problems that require structural solutions. And I campaign on this too. It's not sexy, it's not as sexy, but it's incredibly important.
Next, Danny Cavana from the USC Political Union. Danny?
Hi, I was just wondering how, if at all, you thought queer identity or affiliation with the queer community should impact political participation or.
Well, let me start by not claiming to speak for the entire diverse alphabet that I am a part of in the LGBTQ plus community. But what I'll say is that not only are the priorities of this community, I think, important and deserving, and right now, I think especially important to defend, given the number of people who found it politically convenient to attack some of the most vulnerable Americans because they happen to be part of the queer community. But also that I want to suggest something that's maybe a little counter to the received narrative about identity. So there's this idea about identity, and it's not wrong, sort of, that if we organize ourselves completely around identity, it's isolating. if we treat identity like it's the only thing that matters and are only interested in affiliating with people who match our chosen identity and use that as the lens to understand any and all politics, it can make us smaller and thinner in our conception of the public good that is all about people with jostling interests and jostling values and jostling identities, coming to terms on some rules that we all got to live by. I also have found, though, that leaning into your identity in a certain way can actually have the reverse effect. And what I mean by that is, when I was running for president, talking about how politics was very personal for me, partly because of what was at stake for me, like the fact that the most important thing in my life, which was my marriage, only existed by the grace of a single vote on the US Supreme Court, helped me better understand how decisions made in big white buildings in Washington, D.C. find their way into our most important and personal corners of our lives. That actually opened up a way for me to talk to and about experiences that I didn't have. I talked a lot about belonging, and belonging became one of the biggest themes of our campaign. And I found that as a result, our campaign drew in people who had experiences, or you might call them identities, that were different from mine, but that it resonated with, including neurodiverse people, a lot of people with autism who became really drawn to our campaign and finding a way to empower volunteers with those experiences was incredibly rewarding. I talked a lot about how the search for belonging that a trans kid in middle school just trying to fit in has in common with somebody who has immigrated to this country and is trying to fit into their community or their economy, or an auto worker where I come from, whose entire identity is connected to their job, loses their job, and has a well-intentioned neoliberal training program come along and tell them they're going to be just fine because they can be a nurse now. And trying to explain that's not who I am, even if that's a perfectly choice-worthy profession that I could train and do. That's not me. I'm an auto. And so I think at its best, queer identity or any identity becomes a basis for not just solidarity with those who have the same experience, but affinity for people who have a very different experience, but that fits into some of the same concerns. Whether it's similar patterns of exclusion or similar patterns of belonging. That's what I hope to do with it. In addition to the very specific policy issues that affect communities that I belong to, whether it's the queer community, the veteran community, or just a young generation, young by Washington standards anyway, I guess not young compared to you all, that helps shape who I think I am.
Next, Will Ahrens from the Trojan Democrats. Will?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Coming from a smaller Midwestern city, what was the hope of your presidential run? I'm a Midwesterner myself and kind of feel this way as well, but did you think that the party has pushed too far to the coasts and left behind traditional bases in the Midwest?
I think we did struggle. One of the things that motivated me to run was this sense that we had struggled to connect with the part of the country I came from, even though I believe very strongly that we had the better answers for the part of the country that I came from. And I think a lot of that was allowing some of what we do or believe in to be caricatured as kind of a coastal elite concern, and falling into some of that a little too readily. We're dealing with it right now, and so much depends on just how we explain ourselves. I'll give you a great example: EVs. So EVs kind of culturally code as a well-off coastal liberals person, right? That's just kind of the image, especially for early adopters. So like you're driving your EV while you're sipping your latte on your way to your sushi, going to wherever you are in your coastal city. If you think about it for a minute, the people who would save the most money from having an EV are people who drive the longest distances, which tends to be people in more rural areas. Not only that, the people who will have the easiest time charging an EV are people who live in single family homes, which again is much more common in a place like Indiana than it is in a place like Manhattan. Because there your charging infrastructure isn't an elaborate charging station, it's the plug in your wall at home. And that's how Chastity and I charge our plug-in van. We have a minivan. I never thought I'd be a minivan guy, and then I had twins. Life comes at you fast. Now we have a minivan. It's a Pacifica, and it's a plug-in hybrid. We don't have some complicated convoluted. It's a garage. We plug it in. And it's actually in Middle America, geographically Middle America, where a higher proportion of low and middle income people live in single family homes compared to the coasts, where that's practically unaffordable for a lot of people. And so there's an irony in the fact that something like EVs that have so much to offer, particularly people in the Midwest and in so-called red America, have been perceived as an elite or coastal concern. You add to that the fact that the biggest problem with EV adoption is that they're too expensive. And our policy prescription was to make them cheaper, which is what we did with the Inflation Reduction Act. And all the members of Congress who beat me up in committee hearings for EVs costing too much voted no on making them cheaper. So, and that's before you even get to the economics of building these things. St. Joe County, Indiana, where I come from, is undergoing the biggest manufacturing investment since the departure of Studebaker in 1963. And it's GM building a battery factory. The biggest investment in manufacturing in our blue-collar town since 1963. And it's there because we made a choice as an administration to ensure that the EV revolution was a made in America revolution. So I think we have a great message for the middle of the country. But I agree with the premise of your question that we haven't always talked about that message in the right terms. And much will depend on us finding our voice in that. I think part of how we outperformed expectations in 2022 and in 2020 is that we're getting better at it. But we got some work to do.
Okay, now we have time for some questions from our Zoom audience. And one of them relates to something that you've just been talking about. Sasha Ryu asked, recently there have been concerns raised about EVs leading to job cuts, especially for UAW members. Do you think the administration's EV plan will be able to avoid auto workers facing job cuts?
Yeah, so this is a big issue, right? We need to make sure that the jobs that are being created through this next technology outpace jobs that could be displaced. But I also think this is being presented as a choice that's not honest. It's not as if we can just stick with the old technology and the jobs will stay secure. Instead, what will happen is that the EVs that more and more Americans buy, and the Americans will buy more and more EVs, will be made in China instead of made in America. That's the actual choice. It's not EVs versus not EVs. It's an American industry versus an overseas industry. And the last administration allowed China to build an advantage in EVs, and we're making up for lost time, in my opinion. And if you listen to what Sean Fain and the UAW are saying, they're not saying that we can somehow pickle the old technology and force Americans to use it forever. What they're saying is we have the dawn of a new chapter in the automotive industry that might be the biggest change in the auto industry since it started. And they want to make sure that workers have a fair share, both in terms of the quality and the quantity of union auto jobs that are associated with that industry, which we think, and the president thinks, is totally fair game for a union to be pushing for. Sometimes when I hear these questions, I don't mean the question as it came in, but the questions that are hurled at me sometimes on Capitol Hill, I feel as if it's like 2005 and I'm addressing like the rotary phone convention. And I'm talking to people who are like demanding that we continue using rotary phones for as long as possible. And it's just, that's not how it's going to work. Like the mobile phones are coming and the question is, are we going to be on top of it or are we going to be playing catch up? And that's what's at stake in this EV revolution, that those new technologies are coming either way because they're better technologies. Not that they aren't without their problems, but fundamentally they're better. They're cheaper to own, cheaper to use, and over time will become cheaper to make. And they drive better. And you can fill them up at home, which you can't do with a gas car. If you can't fill them up at home, our administration is working on installing charging infrastructure in places like low-income multifamily dwellings where it's not exactly profitable for a company to put in the charger without a subsidy. That's the course we're on. And it is precisely because I come from a Midwestern town whose economy revolved around the auto industry, that I understand and believe that the stakes couldn't be higher in the EV revolution being American-led and us driving it before somebody else does.
Daniel Lucero asks, Sir, I'm an Army officer and a current USC MPA student interested in running for office. What's your best advice on how I get involved?
Well, that's great to hear. Like I said, there are a few better ways, I think, to prepare for public service than military service. So I hope that you go for it and I hope you succeed. The biggest thing I would say is to tap into those moments when you have been taking care of a diverse group that counted on you, which if you're an officer is happening all the time. Think of the enlisted people who were looking to you for guidance, who you were trying to help, not only in terms of doing their particular job and their particular MOS, but chances are as an officer, you encountered enlisted people looking to you for guidance on just how to, or who you had to mentor, whether they wanted your guidance or not, on how to handle themselves in a professional environment and how to stay on top of their finances and all the other things people need. And then think about how you can make yourself useful to them as an elected leader in the same way that you made yourself useful to them as an appointed officer. That spirit of service is what elected office should be all about. And the rest is just politics.
This question relates to something you talked about earlier. During the first 2 years that you served in the Navy, don't ask, don't tell was still in effect. What was it like to be in the military before that policy was reversed?
Not great. I mean, there are enough problems right now with tacit, implicit, or illegal discrimination. But to be in an organization whose stated policy is to fire you based on who you are, who you love, obviously makes it harder to do your job. I thought it was worth it because I believed in the mission of the Navy and the mission of my unit. But and it was a reserve unit, so I'd leave my day job and then go drill. And the idea that I couldn't, you become close, of course, to the people you serve with, and they're all talking about their wives and kids, and the fact that you can't say that, mind you, I was so deep in the closet, it didn't matter that much. But then part of why I was because I knew I'd lose my job if I wasn't. When I finally came out to a close friend, which I did, I was almost 30 when I did, he patted me on the back and said, you didn't exactly make it easy for yourself with your life choices, because the two things that amounted to a career for me were being in the military and being an elected official in Indiana. And I don't know which one is more or seemed more unfriendly for the LGBTQ world than the other. And of course, the other thing that was remarkable about what changed there was that none of this parade of horribles that people talked about, why you couldn't have out people serving the military, when they got rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, none of that came true. They were saying like unit cohesion be undermined. They thought up all kinds of reasons. And it was all nonsense. It turns out when you do something to remove or address discrimination, whether it is removing an explicitly discriminatory policy like Don't Ask, Don't Tell that so many of us served under, or whether it's using federal funding to deck over a highway that used federal funding 2 generations ago to slice through a community and further segregate it. Whenever you do these things that reverse discrimination or address discrimination, it turns out by eliminating the discrimination, you make some people better off and make nobody worse off. And it's actually pretty hard to find things you can do in public policy anymore that have that quality. Maybe a few you're doing economics and you're doing Pareto optimality, and the idea that, if you can actually make somebody better off without making anybody else worse off, by definition, you should do it. And honestly, by definition, that shouldn't even wind up on a policymaker's desk because that's a technical problem, not a moral one. Yeah, you just have to figure out how. I would argue the rare category of things that have that effect include the elimination of discriminatory policies and choices. And that's what something like the end of DADT and some of what we're trying to do with highways has in common.
So I've got one other question, time for one other question from Zoom. This is from Lawrence Sung. No, it's from Julian Sanchez. Are there any books coming out from you soon?
From me?
Yeah.
No.
You have time to write a book in between the family and your job?
I sure don't. I'm lucky. I'm lucky to be able to pay attention to my own speech writing. And our ethics rules are pretty tight. I wasn't even allowed to write a foreword to the paperback edition of my own book when it came out, because I think it was technically considered a side hustle, and you can't do that as a federal. So I'm taking a lot of notes, and I hope to be able to reflect and write on this someday. What I will tell you is there's a lot of really interesting books that people send me drafts of books now, which is awesome. Not that I get to read them much anyway, but David Leonhardt has a really interesting book out or coming out about kind of the trajectory of America and the importance of investment in things like R&D. Ziblatt and Levitsky have a book out called Tyranny of the Minority, which I think is a very important book for understanding how political problems have been encoded into the structures that we're working with right now, in terms of the way the Senate works and the way the Constitution is set up. And there's some great memoirs coming out there that are piling up on my bedside table. So no shortage of great things to read, but I'm afraid I won't be contributing much to them while I've got this job. I think a tweet is about as much as I can write these days.
Well, look, this was a terrific hour, and I want to express our heartfelt gratitude to you for joining us today for what was a fascinating exchange. Let me thank everybody in our audience for being part of this event, which will soon be available on YouTube and on the newest edition of our Bully Pulpit podcast. Finally, on November 9th at 12:30 p.m., join us on campus or on Zoom for our next event with Adam Nagurney, who covers national politics for the New York Times and who has written an acclaimed new book, which I think maybe you'll put on your bedside table too, entitled The Times: How the Newspaper of Record Survived Scandal, Scorn, and the Transformation of Journalism. It actually may be the best book ever written about American journalism. Thank you again, and everybody have a great day. Thanks, everyone.